Good evening, everybody. We just finished watching the first and only vice presidential debate between Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, Kamala Harris's running mate, and Ohio Senator JD Vance, who is the running mate to former President Donald Trump. I'm Tiana Lowe-Desher, the economics columnist at the Washington Examiner, and I'm here with Christian Daytalk, our White House correspondent. Christian, let's just start with the basics. Who do you think won here?
I think there's no question who won this debate, Tiana. It's JD Vance. He came in as the underdog, like we talked about earlier on Tuesday, and he did essentially everything he needed to do to be victorious. He was able to defend Donald Trump's performance and campaign rhetoric. He tried to the best of his ability to define Kamala Harris as an extreme progressive, an extreme liberal whose policies have the country in this position that we are in right now economically, when it comes to foreign policy, what have you. And he came across as joyful, to be honest, to take a page from the Harris campaign's playbook. He seemed like he was having a good time. He certainly seemed prepared, while on the other hand, Tim Walz fumbled through a lot of his answers. He appeared to forget Gaza during his first answer of the night when asked about the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. And to be honest, it was the total opposite of what we saw from that September debate between Trump and Harris. Walz was rattled, Vance seemed composed, and he seemed vice presidential.
Yeah, and let's be clear, as we discussed earlier, Donald Trump chose JD Vance really for one reason and one reason only, to double down, to cement his legacy. JD Vance was not going to bring in a new state. He represents Ohio, which has been firmly in the Republican column. He's younger, right, but he's also a white man who's from a working class background, really the Donald Trump base. If he existed for any purpose on this ticket, it was to cement this debate, and he did the job. He was he's a much better representative of Donald Trump's record than Donald Trump himself, because we all know Donald Trump sometimes has discipline issues. He gets off topic. He focuses on things that he's interested in. JD Vance was on message the entire time, and that's what he needed to do. And having that split screen with Walz, whose inexperience showed. Remember, in the exact same amount of time since Kamala Harris has been the de facto nominee when Joe Biden withdrew and immediately endorsed her, she and Walz together have done 20 combined unscripted interviews. In that time, Trump and Vance have done 60, and most of those have been Vance because Trump's been limited thanks to all the security issues over the 2 different assassination attempts. So it's all been Vance. So he's been practicing. He's been flooding the zone with hits. He's been doing adversarial media, and it paid off today. That has to be the biggest win for Team Trump tonight.
I do want to hint on one point you just noted out. You talked about Walz being inexperienced in terms of doing hits with adversarial media, doing solo interviews. I was really surprised by his performance because while, yes, that is true, his political career is more than twice as long as JD Vance's. He was elected to Congress back in 2007 and, of course, has been the governor of Minnesota. This was a surprising performance from Walz. That being said, and I want to hear your opinion on this, does it actually move the needle with undecided voters or, again, those Republicans and Democrats who are thinking about maybe not voting for their party's nominee?
As we talked about with the polling earlier, with Vance coming in with historically low net favorables and Walz being sort of in the middle, Vance had a much higher bar to clear, and he cleared it. And what he did, he helped continue the Trump campaign's permission structure. For all the people that were turned off for him by 2016 with his comments about rapists and murderers, for all the people that were turned off by him in 2020 where he was a little bit way too online while he was dealing with COVID, they've created a permission structure for people who, for instance, with the whole abortion messaging that I'm sure we'll get into, Vance saying, I was opposed to the referendum to codify abortion through the point of viability, and I lost because the pro-life movement didn't engender enough trust in the hearts of young female voters in Ohio. Vance helped enable that permission structure to make it so that way people like Elon Musk, who you would have never thought of as a Trump supporter 8 years ago, let alone 4 years ago, Bill Ackerman, all these folks are now able to come along, and Vance as a messenger helped create that by saying it can be a broad coalition. The child care answer I thought was phenomenal because he wasn't saying, oh, we need to get women back in the kitchen and cancel all state-funded childcare options. He wasn't saying, oh, we need to make sure women go back to the boardroom within 2 weeks. He was saying it's a broad tent. Let's invite more people into it. And that's something Republicans historically have not been super successful at. With Walz, Walz looked super awkward. He looked nervous. There were points where it looked like he was sweating and uncomfortable. But I think that probably does matter less in terms of the audience of people that are tuning into a vice presidential debate on CBS.
Let's stick with that child tax credit bit and the paid family leave portion you just alluded to, because this was actually one instance that I noticed. There seemed to be some actual accord on that stage, which was very different, again, from the Trump and Harris debate. Both of these guys are from the Midwest. We hadn't necessarily seen, to borrow your words from earlier, a sort of folksy congeniality from Vance on the campaign trail yet.
Yeah.
But they both came across as someone who was looking to reach across the aisle and try and address these problems, which, let's be honest, both parties recognize but have varying ideas about how to address. Who do you think trying to be bipartisan benefits more in this scenario, Walz or Vance, and by extension, Trump or Harris?
I think it, again, comes down to what were the expectations set before. Vance was set as weird and mean, and instead he came across as extremely normal and highly empathetic. Walz didn't come across as a jerk or anything. He came across as uncomfortable and underprepared, in my opinion. But he didn't need to come across as especially nice, because that's been his whole thing. His whole thing has been to be an understudy that makes Kamala Harris look more impressive in comparison. And quite frankly, if I'm Josh Shapiro tonight, someone that, is incredibly competent, that has created a career on being competent and cementing a lot of power in a very fractious swing state.
And can pull support from the other side.
Exactly. Like Dave McCormick, the Republican Senate candidate, has been cutting ads broadcasting his friendship with Josh Shapiro. You have to be looking at the Walz performance and thinking, this is amateur hour. Like, Harris, the choice of Walz was, to an extent, a little bit of hubris, because she knows that she looks better next to Walz. She knows she looks more impressive. And Trump chose someone who's very young, so that is a contrast to him. But I think even the greatest Trump supporters can recognize that Vance is much more disciplined when it comes to supporting the Trump message.
Let's talk about mistakes, because I do think both candidates made some. Walz obviously had his significant troubles, like we talked about. He had a very poor answer on China. He made a pretty terrible gaffe talking about gun reform, where he said he had befriended school shooters. I am assuming he meant to say victims of school shootings. And he also just sort of, again, like we mentioned at the top, froze up on what should have been telegraphed softball questions regarding the Middle East, regarding hurricane response. Do any one of those moments in particular stick out to you? And then we'll get on to Vance in a second.
It wasn't really until the end that I thought about how it would hurt Harris, because Vance being weak on his own, whatever. People don't vote for the vice president. The vice president rarely wins the election for the presidential candidate. But they can lose it by exposing a flaw. One of the flaws, I think, is hubris, but Trump clearly has some level of hubris there. It was more the fact at the end, he brought up opportunity economy. He did not bring up that term at all during the debate. And that's been the cornerstone of Harris's policy proposals so far as they exist.
It's the summation of her economic agenda.
And it was just such a reminder that she still doesn't have any policy proposals. As far as they exist, they're, homeowners credits, child tax credit expansion stolen from the Trump campaign, and then the care economy and the opportunity economy. And Walz brings up the term opportunity economy in his closing statement, and he didn't say anything else about it because her policy persuasions don't actually exist. And I think that's a bigger weakness than him being awkward and seeming very insecure. As far as Vance goes, the moderators know anytime they ask about January 6th, Trump's post-2020 ruminations, that is never winning territory. You want to look forward, not backwards. And I think Vance pretty deftly got out of it by showing, at the end of the day, Biden did take over. But it's always going to be weak terrain. But that's something that Trump would fall for, not Vance.
Well, just one quick data point on the January 6th response, and this is coming from the Harris campaign, so take it with a grain of salt. They say the January 6th answer from JD Vance, where he said it was a peaceful transfer of power, Facebook ads were more to blame for the riot than Donald Trump, that earned him his lowest marks of the night among their dial-in focus group of undecided voters in battleground states. That's a tongue twister right there. And to your point, I don't think necessarily that is important insofar as we're looking at this from an electoral standpoint. We know that most people in this country have decided who they're going to vote for. Certainly, people on either side of the aisle have already made up their own conceptions of what happened down that day. So for that to be Vance's low point in the debate, I think would be a warning sign for the Harris campaign.
Yeah.
But again, we'll just have to wait and see how big of an issue that is. There's one other instance that stood out for me, and we're running out of time, so we'll just hit it briefly. There was one exchange involving both the economy and immigration, where Tim Walz says, you need to trust the experts. JD Vance retorted, well, the experts were the ones who told us that offshoring manufacturing jobs would get us lower prices, and look at where we wound up. Can this election really be boiled down to the simple idea of do you trust experts or not?
Instinctively, I want to say no, but the answer is probably yes. If you take the gut call from COVID vaccine mandates to the science on, let's say, transgender children and the best way to deal with gender dysphoria among minors, climate change, economists who, the big one that I follow is the fact that economists roundly supported the Inflation Reduction Act. They supported the American Rescue Plan, and we saw what happened with inflation. It was completely wrong. There is reason for people to not trust the science, even if the scientific method and scientific processes and the idea that truth and knowledge is a collective process that we need to come to is correct. And that's what Vance has always been good at channeling into. Going back to when he wrote Hillbilly Elegy, he's been good at channeling that collective id. And this is why I always thought he was underrated among the commentariat for this exact moment. Talking about the best-selling / most influential political memoirist since probably Barack Obama, and that showed tonight. He was charismatic. He did channel the exact insecurity that any right-of-center voter has about why should we trust the economists that said Bidenomics wouldn't stoke inflation. They're now saying Trump's going to stoke inflation, not Harris. And by my record, they're correct to question that.
Well, that's a question that we will continue to harp on over the following month, and I'm sure probably in election cycles to come down the line. But that is all the time we have tonight. I'm Christian Daytok. She's Tiana Lowe-Desher. This has been the Washington Examiner Live. You can follow along with the rest of our post-debate coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.